I'm here today with Bettina Arndt, who has a resume as long as your arm, but briefly, she trained as a clinical psychologist. She became known as one of Australia's leading sex therapists. She's participated in government advisory committees on family law matters, and her day job now is a dating coach, and she has been for many years a prominent social commentator and frequently publishes articles on gender issues. So welcome. How are you, Bettina?
I'm very well. And an apologist for men. That's what they call me.
An apologist for men. Yeah, that's very unpopular.
It's a very important job, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. It's badly needed. So I thought today I would steal a line from the talk that you gave at the men's conference, and we would talk about, the topic would be the unexamined sex lives of men.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're an expert in this area.
Well, I listen a lot to men talking about their unexamined sex lives. Their non-existent sex lives might be more appropriate.
Their non-existent sex lives, yeah. So could you talk briefly about the process that you went through gathering diary information from men and correspondence, and then putting that into a book ultimately? Yeah,
well, it really started not so much looking at men, but looking at how couples negotiate their sex supply. I mean, this is one of the issues that most of us are intrigued by, because we never talk to anyone else about it. We don't really know how other couples deal with this problem, particularly when there's an imbalance between men and women. And I had this idea that I might get couples to keep diaries for me. And, you know, I had some long-suffering friends who let me try it out on them, and then went out and recruited people. And ended up with, 98 couples, and who kept these diaries for up to a year. And this was just an amazing process, because it was really interesting to see his version and her version of the same encounter, or non-encounter, as the case may be. Yeah. So that led to my first project. I mean, that was my sex diary. The book was called The Sex Diaries. But what was really interesting for me was the main reaction to that book was how extraordinary it was to hear the male perspective. You know, the women often talk about this stuff. The women's pages are full of, women's magazines are full of women, complaining or talking about they're men pestering them all the time or whatever it is. And men rarely talk openly. And I just had this extraordinary reaction when that book came out. I mean, men would ring me up and say, I listened to you on the radio talking about this. I was sitting in the car listening to the radio, and there, I had tears rolling down my cheeks. I mean, men incredibly moved to hear they weren't the only ones going through all this stuff. Because, of course, that was the big issue that emerged. The men crying out for more intimacy in their relationships, and being really miserable about how little sex they were getting, but also missing out on something that wasn't just about getting their rocks off, but was about that connection that they'd really hoped would be there in their marriages. And so then even before I finished the first project, I decided to then go and look at other things to do with men. I was actually particularly interested in erections. I've always been fascinated by erections. And some of that is guilt. I mean, if you go back to my early days as a sex therapist, which was way back in the 1970s, we were told then, and all we knew then, was that erections, we thought that was all in the men's heads. And I would sit there with these men saying, you just have to calm down and relax and all be right. And of course, that was total bullshit. I mean, we learned over the next 40 years about this amazing mechanism, this miracle of engineering, which is the male erectile functioning, and how all the pieces come together. And so I was really intrigued by that. And I've always been interested in that. And I feel very guilty about those poor men I saw 40 years ago and told the wrong thing to, Anyway, so that was the erection thing. I wanted to do a whole second book on erections, and my publishers wouldn't let me. They said no one was going to go into a bookshop and say, I want that book on. So I then went out and did a whole broader look at issues that I think are interesting around men and sex. How do men feel about women's bodies? How do men feel about pornography? Why do men take such risks for sex? All sorts of issues. And I managed to sneak in 5 chapters on erections. So that was pretty exciting.
Yeah, maybe you should have just wrapped it up in a nice, fancy drama and called it 50 Shades of Grey, and you would,
Well,
anyone would have bought that.
That would be fine.
Yeah.
But the terrible thing is actually, it is a problem because I've been dead keen to get information out to men. I'm sure we're talking about most men over 50 start to have issues with erections. And they're being incredibly exploited. They're not getting the treatment they need. We live in the age of Viagra, a time when there are really good treatments available, and a lot of men are ending up paying thousands of dollars to clinics that rip them off because they're too embarrassed to talk to each other. They're too embarrassed to go to their doctor. So I really, this is something that I'm very passionate about, the whole business of helping men look after their erections. But that was only a part of this broader issue of, how do men feel about sex? Why is sex so important to men?
Yeah. Well, as you say, there's barrels of ink spilled on, the emotional needs of women. But if you bring up, for example, the sexual needs of men, then all of a sudden you're now talking about rape culture and all kinds of things. Men are sex-crazed animals that just can't control themselves. So how much is this, because this also runs into a biological argument, how much of this is biology? Men have way more testosterone, men and women approach sex differently. So how much of a role is biology in all this?
Yeah, it's hard to know, of course. Because I think back to the 1970s, early 1970s, they discovered the sensuous woman. There were a whole lot of research that came through showing that women were capable of multiple orgasms and we could do all these amazing things. And all these articles were written saying men were never going to be able to keep up with us, and that we'd leave all these exhausted men around. And what a lot of crap that turned out to be, didn't it? Because the reality is female sexuality seems to operate very differently from men, and it's very hard to know how much of that is biological. But I think the testosterone is part of it. But I also think there are obvious cultural issues there. Arguably, if we're talking about a biological basis, it would be to do with mothers aren't meant to be bonking all the time. They're supposed to be looking after their kids.
Yeah.
So we have this very distractible, fragile libido that means that we need perfect conditions for it to light. And that makes perfect sense. You don't want mothers to be concentrating on the job when they're supposed to be looking after their kids.
Yeah.
And I just think all those things of how differently libido operates for men and women is fascinating, and it probably has some biological aspect to it, but it's also complex because it's also cultural, and very cultural at the moment, because women have decided they don't have to have sex if they have no desire.
Yeah.
And that's been a disaster for men.
To be this incompatibility with the way men and women approach sex. So, for example, you just brought up the fact that women need to be free of distraction, whereas for men, sex often is the distraction to distract you from other things in your life, whereas for women, they need to be free of those distractions in order to have sex. It's almost a polar opposite.
And you see that talked about a lot in the women's magazines. Women need to feel close in order to want sex. They want to know what's going on inside his head. They want him to talk to you. It's endless wanting to know what he's thinking, all that stuff. And it is true. Many men and women will say that, and I can't just leave him to bed with him and I'm not feeling close to him. But the problem is, of course, they may feel incredibly close to him and still not want to go to bed with him. Some of this is an excuse, I think, from a female perspective.
Yeah.
But as you say, men are so different. Men can be totally exhausted. I've known men who've moved house and then said, nothing. I feel what a wonderful celebration amongst all the boxes to have a quick bonk, Whereas women, when they're exhausted, it's usually the last thing they feel like. Or, when a man's stressed out about something, the fact that they can use sex as an escape is a wonderful thing for men, but a terrible problem because it's so rare that women can use sex in that way. I have to say, of course, we're generalising, and there'll be men listening to this who aren't remotely like that, and who, when they're tired and stressed, they don't feel like sex either. But broadly, there are these differences.
Yeah, I think there's this quote from your book where I think you've said here that men want sex in order to feel close to women, but women need to feel close to men in order to have sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as I say, I mean, in a way that is true. Women do. It's a prerequisite, I think, for many women to feel like having sex. But even if they feel close, it won't necessarily have the desired outcome for men.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of men are working incredibly hard trying to get the green light, trying to work out what's the magic to make her interested in going to bed with him. And they grovel and they cajole and they cook dinner and they do housework and they do all the things that they think might help, and still doesn't work. What do you do with that?
Yeah. What about this this notion of limerence? So limerence is this idea that men get, they get into a relationship and they have this period where the infatuation period where you're going at it like rabbits, then you get married, and then after you get married, all of a sudden the sex drops off and the man feels like he's been duped, but actually this is biology at play again.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't know how significant this is, but I was very interested. There's research from a woman called Helen Fisher, who's originally an anthropologist in America, and she's done interesting work looking at this limerence period, this early period when you're weak at the knees at the side of each other and you can't get enough. I mean, that whole early excitement phase of falling in love. And she wired men and women up who were in love and looked at their brain, what was happening in their brain mechanisms and brain chemistry and you name it. And she finds that there's a very different brain chemistry operating in men and women at that stage. And it particularly seems to impact on women. So I presented as creating an artificial state of high desire in women. Right. And many women report that to me, saying, I couldn't get enough of him. We were bonking like rabbits. I thought about sex all the time. And I mean, it's a problem for women too, because we think we're like that. We think we're these sexy chicks and we can't get enough sex and we love sex. And then after a few years, that whole limerence period changes. And Helen Fisher found that the brain chemistry changes. You get back to a more normal state, and that normal state is this distractible libido that I've been talking about, where everything has to be totally right for you to remotely feel like it. And that's really problematic. And it's problematic for women too, because we think that's abnormal, that I've lost my libido, what's wrong with me? And I'm suggesting, unfortunately, that may be the total normal state for women, and maybe to do with this idea of looking after their kids and not focusing on sex all the time, you know.
Well, maybe.
I mean, I'll tell you one interesting thing. One of the things that worries me is what's happening with lots of single mums having new relationships, new men coming into their lives, new men they fall in love with. And of course, they've got that whole high libido, wanting sex all the time thing going on. And the gaze shifts from the kids to the man. And I just think that's one of the explanations as to why children are so at risk in many of these families. We know that's one of the highest incidents of sexual abuse, is allowing strange men through the lives of children, particularly in that single mother situation. And to me, it's, when you think about that limerence thing, you could think how dangerous that is for a mother to be in that distractible state with a new man. Yeah,
and unfortunately, most of our government programs sort of incentivize that. I mean, there was a time, maybe you remember, a bit before my time, but when it was considered kind of shameful for a woman to have a child out of wedlock, and that's no longer the case. I mean, I don't think you need to shame women for it, but I don't think it's something that we should encourage. I mean, we know that the best outcomes for children are when they come from two-parent households. But unfortunately, our societies, we celebrate single mums as though it's some accomplishment, when really they do it pretty hard.
Yes, I mean, I've written a lot about that over the years and become extremely unpopular as a result. But I mean, I was monitoring that change that occurred. I remember once talking to a producer of one of the very popular soap operas in Australia, and because you saw that happening, you could see single mums suddenly becoming heroic. The young woman who got pregnant, they had a real problem. It was an early evening program and they couldn't talk about abortion. So that was, so they had, you know, originally they'd have lots of women falling downstairs and lifting heavy suitcases and having, you know, dealing with the pregnancy in that way.
Yeah.
But then there was a turning point where they suddenly decided, no, the way to go is to have her be a struggling single mum, and we'll celebrate the fact of how well she's doing.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that actually that television producer said to me, she used to worry about the impact of all of that. And I've been writing a lot over the years about the fact, the point you make, that children, no question, children are better off with two parents, that dads have a very important role in children's lives. They have an impact on their kids that it's quite different from the role a mother plays, and extremely important. All that's gone out the window, of course. In the celebration of single motherhood, and this constant message that single mothers do just as good a job. You know, we're not allowed to ever suggest that's a worse kind of family.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the evidence is very clear. I mean, just from a financial point of view, it's a struggle. All these kids in lower socioeconomic families are being raised in poverty, and that's a very poor outcome for those children, quite apart from all the social and socialization aspects.
Yeah, I think there was an article in the US celebrating the fact that something like 35% of head of households were women. But when you broke the numbers down, a huge number of those head of household women were women who were earning less than $18,000 a year and were on food stamps and all kinds of welfare. And they were celebrating this because women were head of households.
Oh, it's all madness. The discussion around this is so distorted because there's an enormous incentive, of course, for a lower woman in a lower socioeconomic area to choose the government to support her rather than a man. Most of the men she's going to have in her life are not going to be able to do as good a job providing regular income as the government does. And so we, as you say, we give her an enormous incentive to you know, impregnate herself, to get involved with a man and then get rid of him. And it's just shocking. Yeah.
So around this whole topic, for men to suggest that they should be getting more sex or they would like more sex is kind of difficult in this new age of Puritanism, and that women's needs have to come before everything. If the woman's not on board, well, that's just too bad. So there's there's been some articles about the fact that if men do more housework, they'll get more sex. But there is a bit of a chicken and an egg problem here, isn't there? Whether does more household chores lead to more sex, or does more sex lead to more household chores?
Well,
Did you talk about?
Well, you're talking about the sheets for a start.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, this is classic area of research, which is, when you look carefully at the data, it doesn't hold up. And, you know, the issue that I think comes into play here is resentment, is the fact that if you are a woman who's, as I always say, who's working two jobs, you know, who's juggling, all these sort of fashionable phrases. I mean, not that men don't have to juggle, but that, you know, a woman in that situation comes home and she's with a man who doesn't do anything to help her, and she's going to resent him. Women who are resentful about their partners, there's no way he's going to get any sex. No question. And so that's how the housework issue really plays out. I mean, I've always been interested in that housework issue because, in fact, the researchers were really cross when they discovered if you quiz women about how they feel about doing most of the housework, an awful lot of them say it's actually fine, because they're seeing it as part of a total negotiation around his contribution and her contribution. Men are doing twice as much paid work in Australia, for instance, as women are. The couple often make that decision that she will be out of the workforce and then part-time working while the kids are growing up, and it's a decision they make together. And many women in that situation have no problem with doing the bulk of the work at home. It's just that the researchers endlessly present that as if it's an outrageous deal for women. But it's very much tied up in how does a woman feel about that man? Is it a good relationship? Does she love him? If she's happy with him and they're making mutual decisions around this stuff, she's very happy. with him doing what he can when he struggles in from, you know, driving from his work for 2 hours after working a whatever hour day. I mean, lots of women in good relationships absolutely appreciate what their men do. It's just that we're faced with this cultural barrage suggesting he's not doing enough.
Yeah, and I think you wrote an article on this last year, if I remember rightly. I think I actually put it in one of my videos where you said that when you add together the paid work and housework, men and women are doing about the same. It's just this focus on housework because that's disproportionately done by women, as you say, because women tend to work part-time more. They're going to do more of the housework. That's just the way it's traditionally been. That's the way it still is. But when you add paid work and housework together, men and women are basically contributing about the same number of hours.
Yeah. And, of course, gatekeeping. We're very good at keeping men out of our traditional work area, which is, you know, oh, you don't know how to dress little Johnny for preschool. I'll be really embarrassed if he goes along with that T-shirt. I don't, you know, or here, let me do that. You don't know how to change a nappy. I mean, all that stuff is also part of this equation, and where much as we criticize men, we take over, we undermine them, we laugh at the way they do things, and we don't let men do things the way they want to do it, which might be much more sensible than our perfectionist standards when it comes to, you know, looking after our homes.
And I wonder if you've heard this before, because I've heard this from a lot of men, which is that women, some of the types of cleaning that women do, men see as unnecessary, that if men were left to their own devices, they would do less cleaning than women do. Women are sort of overly fastidious about cleaning. Yeah,
because we're worried about what other people think of us. And men don't, you know, we think other people are going to judge us by the state of our kitchen floor. Or whether we're, you know, cooking or putting the right things in our children's lunch boxes or whatever it is. I mean, that competition between women is very much driving some of this. I think we've got better around that. We've some of our standards are slipping, which is a very good thing. But I've been telling women for so many years, of course, that all this rubbish they do around the house, when it's got nothing to do with pleasing men, it's all in their heads. And most women would be much better off looking after their men sexually than they would spending hours and hours on keeping the perfect house.
Yeah, that's what I think. That was a line out of your book where you say that women will spend hours looking for the you know, special brand of underpants for their man, whereas if you just gave him
a quick
hand job for 5 minutes, that would be that would be more to his liking.
That's right. We were doing a Q&A on this the other day, and one woman was outraged at that suggestion. They're outraged at the idea that you actually might just do something for him sexually. Nothing to do with your own needs or desires, just as a gesture of thanks or acknowledgement that you're with a man who's randy and would like some, you know, you to show that you actually care about him. I mean, it just shows how rare it is to hear that expressed anymore. And what was fascinating in this comment section I was running was a lot of women were saying that. A lot of women were saying, no one ever talks about this. They hear women endlessly complaining about their men and complaining about how annoying they are, plaguing them for sex. And if they dare to say, well, I think he deserves it, I think it's a good thing for me to show him I care about, you know, whether he you know, is wanting some sexual relief or whatever it is, they get howled down by other women. The cultural dialogue around this is appallingly anti-male.
Yeah. I mean, could you identify, my personal experience is that I actually left Australia in about 2001 and I came back just last year. I was out of the country for almost 15 years. And to me, I've had, in a sense, reverse culture shock in a way. I'm just shocked at the sort of belittling of men. And also, you know, just for example, someone tells a joke about a woman, then all of a sudden that means that men are going to go home and commit domestic violence against women. There's this hypersensitivity around women as fragile snowflakes. I mean, when did this sort of happen, this hypersensitivity?
Yeah, it's hard to, because I lived in America from 1986 to 91 and was very aware of it there. You know, this was I saw it as a very anti-male culture, but by the time I came back, it was really obvious to me that that had kicked in with a vengeance in Australia as well. I don't know quite what the time frame was, but it was certainly gathering momentum at that stage. And boy, has it got a grip now. I mean, it is just extraordinary. And how male sexuality is constantly demonized. Sexuality of men is never talked about except in terms of men being in trouble over something. Being in trouble for looking at women in the wrong way, being in trouble for undressing women mentally. There was this, I'll tell you about a fantastic article, which was, it was about a man and his inner goat. And this was a very PC man. I mean, I think it was writing in a newspaper in Britain, and it was published again in Australia. And he talked about how the fact that he used to undress women mentally all the time, but he's learned not to do that anymore. And so he keeps his inner goat firmly tethered. But occasionally he'll break away and he'll find himself looking at a gorgeous woman and thinking about what she looks like naked. And it was a sweet, self-deprecating sort of article of, confessions of a new age man who hasn't quite got it all under control yet. And what was fascinating for me was the comments in response to that. Women still telling him off, saying, oh, I mean, he didn't get any brownie points for acknowledging that he's trying really hard to tether this goat. He just simply got endless comments about, well, you'd have to work harder, along those sort of lines.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's just, men never get any acknowledgement of their extraordinary sexual restraint they're showing in a whole range of areas. And they're constantly caught out. I don't even remember, there was this guy, Macquarie Bank, it was very funny actually, it was a television thing where they crossed to Macquarie Bank for a comment on finance of some sort. And in the background was a guy who was caught on camera looking at a naked woman, a sexy woman. And that went around the world. He was totally shamed at being caught out, how outrageous it was. And as if, I mean, what is wrong with that? Of course, it's outrageous for him to be looking at a sexy photo in the workplace and so on. But I mean, it just drives me crazy how rarely we talk about male sexuality in a celebratory sort of way. What's happened to the Henry Millers and the great, I'm trying to think of some of those famous other male authors. Philip Roth and so on. I mean, these wonderful randy men who used to write about sex in this as this extraordinary, fabulous part of life. They're all extinct now, and the only men who write novels are all about groveling men who get it all wrong and can't get erections and are sort of stumbling around in some inept way rather than rutting and enjoying their sexual encounters, which is what we used to celebrate.
Yeah, I mean, the message that I've always carried myself this way, and it's got me into trouble, admittedly, but I've always thought that there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of as a man that you think about sex a lot or that you look at porn. I mean, as long as you're not obsessive and you're watching it 10 hours a day, but there's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of looking at women, looking at porn, masturbation. None of this should be shameful. No, you should be completely open about it. It's normal. It's natural. There's absolutely nothing to be ashamed about it. But why have men been shamed? Why have they been so cowed? As you say, in marriages, when men aren't getting sex, for the most part, they usually put up with it. But if a woman has a similar gripe, she won't put up with it. Why are men so willing to put up with this stuff?
Yeah, well, I think in the marriages situation, it's about the fact that men know how much they have to lose if they leave a marriage, and most men are in, married men with kids. It's just massive what they have to lose in terms of losing their families, losing huge amounts of their earnings by making that decision. And we've had generations of men grow up now watching their fathers being done in through divorces, and I'm not surprised men are very nervous about it. I had this. I used to have this chat thing on my website when I just published the books around sex, and there was this wonderful letter that was a man wrote in, which was entitled "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" And he was a young father, and he talked about the fact that he you know, had no intimacy, not even any cuddles. So there was no intimacy at all in his marriage, and he just couldn't stand the thought of living the rest of his life like that. And yet but he talked about what he stood to lose with these 2 young kids and the risk that he wouldn't be able to have them be a normal father to them, all of that. And there were hundreds of comments from men back and forth about that equation, about whether it's worth spending your life sex deprived, missing any real intimacy in your relationship, or leaving. And I mean, of course, for men, leaving and taking the risk of getting involved with another woman and finding yourself in the same situation. I mean, that's one of the things that really bothers me. How do you work out whether you're with a woman who is going to have a sexually generous attitude? Because that's what it is. I mean, it's not about finding a really randy woman and thinking you've hit the jackpot, because a lot of us are like that at the start, as we've said. How do you know she is going to make the effort to look after your sexual needs, to get herself in the mood? I mean, I always talk about this whole issue of women now. We've discovered that many women can have sexual pleasure without prior desire, but they have to want to do that. And unless they're willing to explore that or work on that, or say, you know, I want to have sex with my husband tonight, and therefore I'm going to get my head in the right place and look forward to making love to him, do things to make sure I feel like that when the time comes. And lots and lots of women can't be bothered with that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're making a good case for being gay. I think you're also making a good case against marriage. I think you're making a great case for prenuptial agreements, and you're even making a case for MGTOW. So this is all very pessimistic for heterosexual men. I mean, what do you say to the idea that given what men stand to lose in marriage, of course, obviously you should be very selective about who you choose. That's one obvious thing. But I mean, marriage as it is today, I mean, is this a good deal for men? I mean, I don't know if you've read Helen Smith's book, Men on Strike, where she just puts it in terms of, you know, a cost-benefit analysis. If you do a cost-benefit analysis on marriage, it doesn't stack up very well for men. So, I mean, what is the answer?
Oh, I think there's no question. Marriage is an enormous risk for men. And if you looked at it rationally, very few men would go into it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And yet, I mean, there are enormous pleasures there. I mean, I just think nothing competes with the joy of having children in your life. I've always felt that as a woman, but I see it with so many men, and here we are endlessly encouraging men to get engaged in their kids, to you know, to really be involved and embrace being the father. And then we just rip the rug out from under them. I mean, how crazy is that? So I am pretty pessimistic. I think it is a lousy deal for men. But having said that, I think there are fabulous women out there, and I'm lucky because I suppose I always attract those women. They come to me and say, I can't understand why women are treating men so badly. I look after my husband sexually. I mean, they're there. The question is how to find them.
Yeah. I mean, is it...
I think all prospective wives should be forced to read my books and to talk through their attitudes toward them. Because, you know, they're never put on the spot and asked, how would you feel if? Would you think it's reasonable? If you didn't have prior desire, would you still think your job is to get your head in the right place and get in the mood? Because that's part of a marriage. I mean, how would you feel about that proposition? That's one of the key issues men just need to talk to women about. Yeah.
Well, how about this idea, if you are in a marriage and it's, you know, the sex is dried up, this idea of scheduling, which sounds on the face of it that it takes the spontaneity out of it. That if you like schedule, well, we're going to have sex once a week, Saturday night. Does that work, and why does it work?
Well, it certainly can work. I mean, the problem is if it's not scheduled, it drops off the agenda. You know, you think, oh, well, tonight's the night, and then you watch 3 extra episodes of whatever it is, Mad Men or whatever show you're into, and it's too late, you can't be bothered, whatever. I mean, I tell you where it comes up a lot is men taking Viagra. Viagra is a drug which used to be really expensive. It's not as expensive as it used to be, but you know, it takes an hour to kick in, and you pop the little blue pill, and then by the time you get, you know, you're ready, she's fast asleep. I mean, that whole thing of sex in everyday life is really hard, and particularly people with young kids. And you've got to, the reason you've got to schedule, you've got to get the kids taken away so you can just spend a Saturday afternoon in bed together.
Yeah.
And you've got to, you know, I think it's particularly around the children that it's extremely important to schedule a time when you won't be interrupted and you won't be distracted. And also this point I keep making is you can prepare for it mentally. And that's really important for women. To say, I'm not going to schedule, you know, a day full of when I'm going to do 1,000 things and run around and get totally exhausted. I'm going to try to relax and do things that make me feel sexy and good. So I look forward to bonking my husband, you know. That's part of that story. And it can really work, but it only works if the woman wants it to work. Now, you know, there are thousands of books about negotiating these issues. And most women won't even read them. That's the problem. I have men endlessly say, well, how do I get her to even talk about this, let alone do anything about it? Well, we went along for counselling, and all the counsellor wanted to talk about is why I'm not doing this or that or the other. You know, why aren't I emotionally available to her? Why aren't I doing more housework? Why aren't I doing this or that? You know, they talk about all the things that are irritating about that man, and they never talk about this big issue for him.
Yeah. So, I mean, is some of this problem, we live in an age of sort of narcissism, self-involvement. It's all about us, me, and that instead of seeing a marriage or a relationship as a partnership, as something where you give and take, that it's because we're so self-involved and we're not willing to look at it as a team situation. I
mean, as I say, some people still do. But the interesting thing for me in terms of sex is that somehow sex got left out of that equation. And there are lots of women who would say, oh, I negotiate. They negotiate around, you know, who's looking after the kids tonight or whatever it is. Whole range of issues they're happy to negotiate about. Somehow, and it's very much been a feminist argument that sex is different, that we can't deal with sex the way we deal with, you know, cooking spaghetti. You don't like spaghetti, but he likes spaghetti. You're happy to do it for him. Right. Oh, you can't talk about sex in that way. It's outrageous to suggest that she would do it for him if she didn't feel like it. And then they immediately leap into the, you know, suggesting that means you're a rape apologist. You're, you know, promoting men to force themselves on women, etc. I mean, it's very interesting, that tricky thinking that immediately comes into the equation when you suggest this is something reasonable for people to negotiate.
Yeah. Well, then that leads to another topic. It's funny that, you know, you bring up feminists and this idea that you pleasure someone even though you don't feel like it. I mean, I'm sure that men have been in that situation as well. But then if you switch to another, I mentioned to you earlier about this new report that came out, which I'll probably do a video on in the next couple of days, about sex robots and about the ethical implications of sex robots. And of course, the chief concern of feminism is always, well, it's going to objectify women, it's going to promote rape culture, it's going to lead to more violence against women, which seems to me an argument doesn't really stand up, because it's the same thing they said about computer games. We're going to make people more violent. But in this way, it's strange that it just seems like feminists don't like men enjoying themselves in any way whatsoever, even when it doesn't involve them. They can't stand it.
I mean, the real threat, of course, is it might replace women. And that's a horrible thought, you know. I mean, we still find having men around very useful for some things. I mean, supporting us for a start, you know. So, I mean, I just think that's the bottom line in all this issue. It's the same with pornography. I mean, pornography is about men wanking, isn't it? It's about men masturbating, and having something lovely and sexy to look at when they're doing so, and enhancing the experience of masturbation. And that's something women have always hated. Not all women. I mean, there was a brand of feminism a few years back which was very pro-sex, and there were some wonderful advocates for a few of them, but I don't know what happened to them all, because I think they've all been stomped out by the anti-male, anti-sex people.
The only one I know,
sorry.
The only one I know who's still around is probably Camille Paglia. She still talks.
Oh, Camille, yes, absolutely. But there were a few of them, and they strenuously tried to resist the sort of Andrew Dworkin's rubbish about, you know, all intercourse being raped and so on, being rape. And yeah, you don't hear much from them anymore. And it's become very much an argument that everything to do with male sexuality is negative. Anything to do with men pleasuring themselves is a bad thing. Pornography, as you say, pornography is all about that. Yeah. I mean, I love, if you look at the way 50 Shades of Grey was talked about. When that came out, there was this huge outpouring of therapists saying, oh, how wonderful, this is mommy's little porn, you know, little porn, and it's teaching us to, you know, enjoy our sexuality. And of course, women, it doesn't mean that women are really into S&M or wanting to be dominated. I mean, we can distinguish between that sort of fantasy material and real life sex. And then, of course, Daddy's, you know, little porn is his nasty, dirty secret, something he's made to feel ashamed of. And he, you know, the problem is, of course, he'll want exactly what he sees in this video, and he can't distinguish between. I mean, the way we treat men and women so differently in all these arguments is just extraordinary hypocrisy. Yeah,
I mean, as you say, we've known for decades that men are far more visual creatures. I mean, this is well established, and that's all porn is. It's a visual cue. It's something to get you aroused and excited by. That's all. That's the reason they watch it.
It's always been there. Yeah. I mean, I remember one of my men talked about when he was growing up. He used to leap on the Kmart catalogue when it arrived in the, you know, the Sunday newspaper to look for women in underwear. I mean, men have always looked for visual. They love women's bodies, and why wouldn't they?
I remember that because I was a kid in the 80s. There was no internet, and that's all you had. You got the Video Easy catalog, and on the back there was, you know, a couple of sort of what were they, the XX videos, you know, a couple of new releases.
And the National Geographic photos of the women with their breasts down near their waists. And, we used to look at. I used to, back in those days, I used to smuggle in. You could get slides in those days of genitals of males and females. I mean, and when I was doing sex education stuff, I just want to show some of that to people to show the great variation in male and female bodies. Yeah. And it's because we never had a chance to see all that. I mean, I just think a lot of the material, sexual material on the internet has been wonderful for people, teaching people how varied we all are. I mean, this idea that it's all airbrushed, all artificial women and their black stilettos, and that's just rubbish. I mean, one of the big booming areas of porn, of course, is do-it-yourself porn, is, you know, setting up the webcam and photographing yourself masturbating or having it off with your hubby, and the you know, the dressing gown is hanging there on the door, and it's all very. These are the people next door. This is not airbrushed, you know, perfect women. And yet that's one of the things, I gather, that's one of the things a lot of men really enjoy seeing, or women.
Well, this is all part of the new Puritanism, is it? Because I remember recently a sex doll company was talking about their new line of products, and of course the feminists pounced on them and told it was all misogynistic and rape culture. And they came out and said, look, listen, a lot of our customers are heterosexual couples, they are lesbians, they are disabled men. So it's not just some geeky guy who can't get laid. But there seems to be this new Puritanism, which you would have associated with right-wing conservative religious people decades ago. But now it's the left-wing feminist sort of cultural.
There is this unholy alliance between the really conservative, and, you know, some of it is a Christian thing, and I mean a whole bunch of really conservative people who are pretty anti-sex, and the feminists, and they're, you know, that's where the big porn argument gets reinforced, with two big groups coming together and arguing that it's all addictive and dangerous, and you know, about men turning into sex monsters and all a total nonsense being talked about pornography, but also a whole range of other topics as well to do with male sexuality. And it's just appalling how men are being demonized in that whole debate.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been following recently in London that they're having certain types of billboards removed of sexy women, you know, in lingerie, advertising bikinis, all kinds of things like that. They're going to remove those. When it comes to men with their shirts off, advertising underpants, that's fine. But apparently we can't objectify women anymore in the London subway.
Hypocrisy that, you know, you look at the Bucks nights or the, you know, the women equivalent. I mean, have you ever been to a male strip show? I mean, there, of course, are lots of women who love that bawdy element, who like looking at naked bodies, who like flirting, who like making suggestive comments. And when I'm doing, you know, I do this online dating coaching where I help people prepare their profiles. And when a woman is like that, and particularly if she works in a male workplace, I mean, I've had a woman who ran a trucking company, and a woman, I mean, these are women who get male humor, who enjoy that, who enjoy a bit of banter very often, and they're not remotely put off by the odd sexy joke. And I really make sure that's there in their profile, because I think men find that so refreshing to know this is not going to be a woman who's wagging her finger at them. Here's a woman who actually enjoys all that element of men.
But in some ways, men are their own worst enemy, because I don't know if you've been following the recent AFL machinations with two senior executives in the AFL had affairs with younger women in the organisation, consensual affairs. The women did not complain. There's no complaint being made. These men are married, so obviously they've cheated on their wives, but they've resigned straight away. And there's this sort of big outcry of how terrible this is, even though the women in question have no complaints. They haven't made any complaints against the men. And actually one woman's emails have come to light where she's admitted to a friend that, look, he's not going to leave his wife and I can walk away from this any time. There's actually, apart from the fact that they're cheating on their wives, which is a personal matter, but they've had, you know, there's a big song and dance over this. They've had to resign. I mean, have you been following?
Oh, it's outrageous. And I was very pleased to see Catherine Lumby, who's a professor who's done a lot of work around harassment. She actually spoke out about that and said it's ridiculous to not give women any agency in that decision. I mean, if anyone was going to be fired, why weren't the women fired too? I mean, it's none of anyone's business, this constant intrusion into people's personal lives. And that is growing, and it's being driven very much by a lot of particularly female attitudes to things like monogamy. I mean, monogamy and that whole issue of faithfulness in marriage has been something that's always interested me. And, you know, it's not true that there is this enormous gap between men and women. Most men want to be faithful too. Most men are very keen on the idea of trying to have that sort of commitment in their marriage. But there are an awful lot of men who realize things happen. You know, sometimes there'll be you might find yourself late night working at a conference or whatever it is. Things happen. You end up naked with the wrong person. And it's tiny numbers we're dealing with here. 2% of Australian men have an affair in any year. If you look over their lifetime, you know, those numbers start to add up, and there'll be quite a lot of married men who at some stage will have lapsed, if you like. But those men, if they're caught out, will say, I was committed to the marriage. I mean, you know, there's always this refrain, I'm a happily married man, I'm still committed to the marriage, I love my wife. And that sort can be all perfectly true. It doesn't necessarily mean he's not interested in being committed to his primary relationship. He can still find himself having a sexual relationship that doesn't mean anything in terms of his overall emotional commitment to his marriage. And yet women just hate that idea, and women find that very difficult to understand, even though more of them are beginning to do it too. There's this constant cultural refrain around this being ridiculous. There's more and more pressure on people to think they're going to be able to live their whole lives being totally monogamous. And it's rubbish. It's not going to be the case. And to put so much pressure on marriage is doing marriage an enormous disservice in thinking marriage has to be absolutely about total honesty and never any lies and never anyone going behind the other person's back. possible strain. I know you're interested in Dan Savage, the fantastic, you know, of course, Dan Savage is a columnist in America, gay guy who started giving advice as a joke to heterosexual people about their sex lives. And of course, he's become this huge agony uncle. Yeah. And of course, he tells it as it is. He tells married women, look at us men with our testosterone. Look at what happens when we put two men together. We have, you know, gay males are renowned for having very strong sex lives and not being particularly monogamous and so on. And yet women think they can rein men in. Women think that they can turn these men into something like them.
Yeah.
And it's just not going to happen. Yeah. I mean, I think Dan Savage absolutely tells it as it is.
Yeah. Well,
but we don't hear that very often.
If you're going to insist on monogamy, which is fair enough, but then you're not going to oblige with sex, and then you're going to forbid the man from going outside the marriage, and you're going to forbid all kinds of pornography or sex dolls or whatever. I mean, what's a man to do? I mean, where does...
And men amaze me. I mean, I get letters all the time from men saying, I don't want to have affairs. I don't want to go to prostitutes, but I'm going crazy here. I mean, just this yearning to be touched, yearning for some intimacy. I remember one man wrote to me, and he finally responded to an ad in the North Shore Times, a little local paper it was a classic. Yeah, you know, a prostitute, essentially, advertising her services, and he's done this wonderful relationship with this woman who's been seeing for a few years now. And he loves his wife, he's got a very good marriage, she's had some health issues. So there are reasons why this woman, he feels, genuine reasons why it's very hard for her to be interested in sex. And he felt this was the best solution, but the agonizing that man went through when it came to whether to do this or not, whether he was betraying his marriage vows. And I hear this again and again and again. Men don't take that, most men don't take that decision lightly at all. And when they stray from the marriage, they do so after enormous soul searching. And I just think it's extraordinary we've got away with locking men down to the degree we have.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, maybe because I know you wrote an article last year where you basically said that one way that you can guarantee, or not guarantee, but more likely for your marriage to stay together is for the man to give in to his wife. This was an article you wrote, I think, in the Australian last year. And I think from my own perspective, probably one of the reasons that I have never been able to maintain a long-term relationship is because I refuse to give in to the demands of a woman. I just, something about me, I just won't. You know, I'll compromise on certain things, but there's just certain things that I won't do. But you made the point that if men give in, it makes their marriage more likely.
I actually didn't. That came from probably the world leading expert on marriage, John Gottman, has been studying marriage for I don't know how many years. He's this huge guru in America, and he said that. He said after looking at a whole bunch of research they did, working out which marriages lasted and which didn't, that was the overriding conclusion, that the marriages that last were the marriages where men gave in to their wives and did what they wanted. And yet, you know, it's an interesting element in there, because where is the sex in all of that? I mean, women, I don't think, find men they walk all over very sexy, you know. I do think there's a sort of primitive thing in many women of enjoying a man who's quite strong and in a sense dominating and powerful. And if men just lie back and let us walk all over them, why would we think they're sexy?
Yeah, you won't have any respect for them.
No, and that is, I mean, I think there are really interesting issues there when it comes to female desire. And you know, they want men who are compliant in all sorts of other aspects. But do those men turn them on? I don't know. I was talking the other day about one of my diarists was talking about the whole housework issue and so on. Then she said they just had a new kitchen put in, kitchen floor, and she was watching this man wrestle this huge refrigerator back into position on their new granite floor. And you know, there was this whole element, and she wrote about it very honestly, that watching a powerful physical specimen, you know, doing something very masculine really turned her on. And we don't acknowledge that very much. And what role that plays in diminishing women's desire for men if we totally eliminate that.
This sort of speaks to a phenomenon I think that people like Mark Latham talk about, this sort of dichotomy between what the elites think and what goes on out in the suburbs. And so, there are probably plenty of women out in the suburbs married to tradesmen, builders, these kind of guys who are in shape, who do physical labor for a living, find that attractive in the old-fashioned way. But on the TV, in our ABC Fairfax kind of world, men are these, very well groomed and thin with their little
pushing a Hoover around the floor, pushing a vacuum cleaner around the floor. That's what's
obsequious. Yeah,
I know, and but so many areas, like women not choosing what sort of friends men are allowed to have in their lives.
Yeah,
just issue after issue where we decide things. Women writing to me saying, look, I know he didn't want to have any more children. I married this man who'd been married before. He didn't want any more children. But I'm hoping he'll change his mind about that. And if not, we might have a supposed accident. These just assumptions that the issues that men care about aren't a big issue really at all, because I'll get around him in some way.
Yeah.
Oh, it makes me so mad.
I think sport was one you talked about, because as a kid, when I grew up, my father really... He played all kinds of sport with us as little kids, from the age we could actually pick up a ball or something, right through, till we were 10, into our teenage years, and we could sort of look after ourselves. And he was the one who drove and really encouraged us a lot. And my mother was there as well. She would drive us around to places. But you've been talking recently how women have taken over the decision on what sports the sons will play.
Yeah. And that's because my boys played rugby, and in the beginning I was very bewildered by it, and I thought it was sort of secret men's business. And of course, most mothers are worried about their sons playing what they see as a violent sport. And that taught me an enormous amount. I became one of their huge supporters, running up and down, screaming on the sideline. And I used to do tuck shop at my boys' school and watch these little boys lining up in the tuck shop line, and they'd be, nudging each other and jumping on each other, and roughhousing in various ways. And it just taught me how important all that is for males. And one of the things, of course, it does is teaches them to deal with their physicality, their masculine strength in a way that is, where they can control it and not get angry and not lash out. In a sports field, if you give someone a thump, we all like a bit of biff, but you have to do it in a subtle way so the ref doesn't notice. But it teaches you rules. It teaches you how to operate as a big bloke. And watching my boys really taught me that. And I'm just amazed, because in my son's school, rugby is dying a very painful death, and soccer is getting stronger and stronger, and it's all coming from the mothers. And I once spent the whole Saturday morning walking around a soccer field, talking to these blokes, big blokes, and saying, what sport did you play when you were growing up? Oh, I played rugby. Well, why is your son's doing soccer? Why is, oh, mum thinks it's safer. Mum thinks this, what? Yeah. Come on, guys. Well, get a grip.
You just, Yeah, you don't give me much hope. This entire conversation just seems to be about men that have become cowed, that have become shamed, and that just don't stick up for themselves anymore. And it's kind of sad. So I don't know.
Well, we have to start the rebellion. I've got X years left to campaign, and one of the things I want to do is say to men, stand up for yourself. And choose women really carefully, and choose women who will value the things that make you an interesting masculine man, and not turn you into a total wimp.
All right. Well, maybe we'll leave it there with that positive message. I think we're coming up on an hour about now. So I want to thank you again for joining us today, Bettina.
Scott, very nice to talk to you.
Excellent.